The house, without laughter, the Carter estate, sat at the edge of a quiet suburb, cloaked in the kind of old money elegance that sparked envy and whispered rumors among neighbors. Its manicured lawns and imposing facade promised warmth and prosperity, but inside, the corridors echoed with a chilling silence. A home defined less by joy and more by careful calculation. Emily Carter, barely 23, floated through the mansion like a shadow. She moved silently, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, as if she tried not to disturb the heavy air. Her mother had died when Emily was just a little girl, leaving her with faded memories and the lingering scent of lavender that sometimes seemed to drift through the halls. In her place was Victoria, a woman whose beauty was legendary, but whose kindness was strictly rationed. Behind closed doors, Victoria's smiles vanished, replaced by sharp commands and cool glances. Chloe, the daughter Victoria brought into the marriage, followed her mother's lead, mocking Emily's reserved nature, turning every family gathering into a subtle battleground. Despite the privilege that came with Richard Carter's fortune, Emily's world was defined by absence. Her father adored her in his own way, but was always moving. Business trips, charity galas, late-night phone calls. More often than not, dinner at the long mahogany table was a silent affair. Victoria dictating the menu, Chloe scrolling through her phone, Richard barely present in body, let alone in spirit. Emily learned early not to ask for affection. She sipped her soup, nodded when spoken to, and disappeared to her room as soon as permission was granted. Life in the Carter household operated by unspoken rules. Victoria reigned over the staff as if she were royalty, her expectations spelled out in clipped tones and raised eyebrows. Emily saw the fear in the maid's eyes whenever Victoria entered a room, and the flurry of activity triggered by Chloe's smallest complaints. She overheard whispered conversations in the kitchen, stories of staff let go for trivial mistakes or for simply getting on the wrong side of the lady of the house. Emily wished she could offer comfort, but loyalty to Victoria and fear kept everyone apart. School had been an escape, but only just. Tutors arrived and left on strict schedules, few lasting longer than a semester under Victoria's scrutiny.
Richard.
Friends rarely visited. Invitations were declined, or when accepted, met with icy hospitality. On the rare occasions when Emily did sneak away, she was met with suspicion and subtle reminders of her duty, even in her private sanctuary, the sunlit corner of the attic where her childhood drawings hung like fragile reminders of happier times. Emily felt watched, her solace limited and always temporary. Photographs on the walls told a carefully curated story. Here, Richard beaming at a gala. There, Chloe and Victoria dressed in matching designer gowns. Emily appeared occasionally, always at the edge of the frame, her smile tentative. She often wondered how outsiders viewed her family. From afar, they seemed perfect. No one saw the way Victoria's touch lingered just a second too long on Chloe's shoulder, a silent declaration of her true allegiance. No one heard the bitterness that laced the conversations behind closed doors. Emily's world, though gilded, was painfully small. Love was a memory, comfort a luxury. She clung to fading hopes that her father might notice the gulf widening in his own home, that maybe, one day, things would change. But for now, her days drifted by in a haze of quiet endurance, a daughter out of place in a house that had forgotten how to laugh. The scars no one sees. In the Carter household, the wounds weren't always visible. Emily's pain rarely left marks that the world could notice, but every day left its own set of scars, deep, invisible, but painfully real. The routine humiliations were woven into the fabric of her daily life. Breakfast was a quiet display of hierarchy. Victoria at the head of the table, Chloe beside her, their plates filled with fresh fruit and pastries, hand-picked by the kitchen staff. Emily's plate, by contrast, often arrived late or with meager portions. An apple slightly bruised, scrambled eggs already cooling by the time they reached her. The message was never spoken, but always clear. You're here, but you don't belong. It was the same when it came to possessions. While Chloe was showered with designer clothes, jewelry, and the latest tech gadgets, Emily's requests, no matter how modest, were forgotten or denied as unnecessary. Birthdays came and went with little more than polite acknowledgement. Christmas mornings, Chloe's gifts spilled across the living room in bright wrapping and gold ribbons. Emily sat to the side, small, chosen with little thought, often practical rather than personal. Each slight reminded her how little affection could cost someone who had so much. Beyond material things, it was the intangible losses that cut the deepest. Emily was rarely invited on family outings. When the Carters hosted summer garden parties for their affluent friends, she moved invisibly through the crowd, fetching drinks or tending to Chloe's whims. If she dared laugh too loudly or interrupt, Victoria's frosty glare would silence her instantly. Chloe would smirk, watching her sister's embarrassment with quiet satisfaction. Emily's childhood memories were painted in shades of loneliness. She had once tried to win their approval, bringing home perfect grades, crafting little gifts for Victoria on Mother's Day, offering to help Chloe with her homework.
Welcome.
But nothing seemed good
Thank
enough.
you.
The best she received were empty words. "That's expected," Victoria would say, or "maybe next time you'll do better." Chloe's response was usually just a dismissive shrug. With her father away so often, Emily learned how to disappear. If Richard happened to ask about her, Victoria would answer on her behalf. "She's fine, just a little shy," brushing off any hint of discomfort in the household.
I heard it was something
When Emily
bad.
attempted to confide in him, hoping for even a moment of attention, he would listen with kind eyes, then urge her to be patient, to try harder to get along. Each half-hearted reassurance only emphasized that she was on her own. There were fleeting moments of warmth, a loyal gardener who sneaked her fresh roses, a kind housekeeper who taught her to bake cookies in secret. But even these comforts were tinged with anxiety. Anyone who showed her too much affection risked earning Victoria's ire. Inevitably, staff who were friendly with Emily soon disappeared, replaced by those more loyal to Victoria's strict code. Beneath these daily slights, Emily's resilience was tested. She nursed silent wishes for escape, counting down the days until she could leave for college or carve out a life of her own. Yet even at school, the Carter name was a gilded cage. Teachers held her to impossibly high standards. Students eyed her with envy or suspicion, and Chloe's whispered gossip lingered in the hallways long after Emily passed by. Each invisible wound shaped her, teaching her to guard her heart, to withdraw rather than trust, to find solace in books and solitary walks through the estate's gardens. As the years slipped by, Emily no longer expected joy or fairness. She simply sought peace, the kind that came from learning how to endure rather than belong. an unexpected turning point.
I was wrong.
Tension
and I
in the
apologize
Carter
for my
household
silence.
had
Thank you.
always simmered beneath the surface, but it erupted with stunning intensity one stormy October evening. Emily had come to accept invisibility as her armor,
It was manipulation,
drifting through her
all of it.
days on autopilot. Yet, even the most carefully constructed walls can crumble
That's a fair
against the
reputation.
force of fate. It began
We
with a
want
sudden phone
fair
call
process
from
for
Richard's business
everyone
partner.
involved.
Emily was in her room,
It's so
curled
good
up
to
with
be
a book,
together again.
when a frantic knock at her door
I completely
jolted
agree.
her
This is what
upright.
home feels like.
Downstairs, Victoria was shouting into the cordless phone, her composure shattered. Chloe hovered nearby, her expression an uneasy mix of confusion and calculation. "Your father's in the hospital," Victoria announced, voice clipped, betraying only the barest hint of concern. She relayed the facts coldly. Richard had collapsed during a board meeting downtown and was now in critical condition. With no time to process the fear coiling in her chest, Emily was swept into the back seat
No, I do
of the
not.
family's SUV as Victoria sped them through rain-slicked streets. Chloe glued to her phone the entire ride. At the
Thank you.
hospital,
We'll
the
make sure
air
this
was
counts.
thick with antiseptic and dread. Emily was the
Just wish
first
I
to
knew
reach
what was
Richard's
happening
bedside.
to us.
Tubes and wires transformed her once invincible father
Betrayer, this
into
will
something
survive.
heartbreakingly
I'm
fragile.
overturning.
His eyes fluttered open just long enough to meet Emily's. And in that brief moment, love and regret flashed unmistakably across his face. Victoria wasted no time asserting control, interrogating the doctors and demanding updates. It became clear that while she performed the role of a concerned wife, her priorities lay elsewhere. Even as she gripped Richard's hand, her mind was already calculating the next
The house
move:
truly feels
bank
like a home
accounts,
now. Yes,
insurance
it does.
policies, the future of the Carter estate.
You have no right to do
Days
this.
at the hospital blurred into
You have
nights.
every right.
Emily, driven by a tidal wave of guilt and longing, devoted herself to her father's care. She read to him by his bedside, brushed his thinning hair, and offered gentle reassurances she wasn't sure he could hear. Each act, no matter how small, was an attempt to bridge the chasm left by years of emotional distance. In contrast, Chloe treated the vigil as an inconvenience, slipping out for shopping trips and posting cryptic updates on social media. Victoria, meanwhile, played her audience
just want the
skillfully,
truth to be out
showing
there.
glistening tears to visitors, reporting on Richard's condition to the neighbors, and subtly
I am the
casting
one who has
Emily
been wronged
as a
here.
withdrawn, ungrateful daughter. The home, once
I
lifeless,
don't know who signed
now
them.
pulsed with a different kind of
It's
energy,
not my signature.
the desperation of people
You are
circling
hereby
a wounded
sentenced to
animal.
prison time and
Victoria called the
restitution,
family's
with all
attorney
assets
within
seized to
days,
repay the victims.
seeking updates on Richard's will. Emily overheard whispered conversations late at night. Words like primary beneficiary
It's about
and
building a
contesting
better future
inheritance
together.
floated through
For
the
everyone.
hallways,
I agree.
chilling
It
her
is time.
already unsettled
Yes,
heart.
this is wonderful.
It soon became clear to Emily that, beyond Richard's survival, another battle was unfolding. Victoria and Chloe, united by greed and fear, began cementing alliances with distant relatives, charming community members,
I'm sorry.
carefully reshaping the local narrative.
Maybe one day we
Emily,
can start over.
suddenly the subject of speculative gossip, watched as old family friends became cool, neighbors stared with pity or skepticism, and even household staff grew guarded,
Thank you.
uncertain
Thank you.
which side offered the safest future. Despite the swirling schemes around her, Emily's focus remained steadfast, caring for her father and finding solace in fleeting moments of kindness. A nurse's gentle smile, an aide's whispered blessing. Through these dark days, she found a well of strength she hadn't known existed, quietly vowing not to let Victoria's injustice define her. The turning point arrived with Richard's final conversation. One morning, as pale sunlight spilled into the hospital room. He reached for Emily's hand, his voice barely more than a whisper. He apologized for his distance, told her she deserved better, and with a father's trembling conviction, promised things would change. Emily pressed his hand to her cheek, blinking back tears, clinging to the hope that some fragment of family might be saved. But as Richard's life faded, the shadows in the Carter mansion only lengthened. What Emily did not yet realize was that his passing would ignite not only grief, but a struggle for identity, inheritance, and the very soul of the family name. The first storm had come. The battle was only beginning. The fateful will. The world seemed to move in slow motion after Richard Carter's funeral. The gray October sky matched the subdued mood that had settled over the Carter mansion, casting long shadows across its ivy-covered walls and echoing through the marble-floored halls. Black-clad mourners came and went, their condolences perfunctory, their curiosity barely veiled behind sympathetic smiles. Through it all, Emily moved quietly, her face composed but pale, bracing herself for the inevitable storm she knew was waiting just beneath the surface. In the days following the funeral, the house was thick with an uneasy silence. Victoria grieved loudly and dramatically for all to see, sobbing into expensive silk handkerchiefs, while Chloe offered her faux comfort, never straying far from her mother's side. To the outside world, they were the picture of a heartbroken family, united in loss. But inside, Emily sensed something more calculated brewing. She caught the sharp glances Victoria cast toward the library, where Richard's legal documents were kept, saw the way Chloe's fingers rolled and unrolled the same strand of pearls, as if rehearsing a performance. Emily felt the isolation settle into her bones. Despite the constant flow of people, relatives, old friends of her father's, business partners, none lingered by her side. Few offered more than cautious platitudes, as if uncertain which branch of the family tree to back. She spent her nights wandering the empty hallways, listening to the echoes and replaying her father's final words. "Things will be different, Emily. I promise." His voice haunted her, its bittersweet reassurance only sharpening the uncertainty she felt. The day of the will reading arrived with a heaviness that pressed on everyone in the house. An autumn wind rattled loose branches against the stained glass windows as the family's attorney, Mr. Sanders, arrived. A tall, meticulous man with silver hair and a briefcase that, today, felt more like a harbinger than a tool of business. Victoria had orchestrated the gathering with precision, as if staging another charity gala. She swept into the parlor in a black designer dress, makeup immaculate despite her theatrically reddened eyes. Chloe followed, dressed down but strategically vulnerable. Emily, in a modest dark skirt and blouse, entered quietly, choosing a seat as far from her stepmother as etiquette allowed. The air was charged, electric with anticipation, tension, greed. Mr. Sanders removed a thick envelope from his briefcase and placed it solemnly on the table. "Your father made several amendments to his will in recent months," he began, his voice calm but deliberate. His intention was to provide stability and fairness. What I'm about to read is his final, legally binding version. For a moment, no one breathed. He began with formalities, charitable donations, provisions for longtime staff, endowments to various causes Richard had supported. Then, the moment everyone was waiting for, the division of the family's vast estate. "To my daughter, Emily Carter, Sanders read. I leave the entirety of the Carter residence, all associated properties, controlling shares in Carter Holdings, and the majority of my financial assets. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The rest of Richard's fortune, smaller properties, minor investments, a trust fund, was left to Victoria and Chloe, with the additional clause that neither could access these funds if found guilty of contesting the will or harassing Emily in any way. There were further stipulations. Emily was encouraged to continue the family's tradition of philanthropy, to safeguard the mansion's heritage, and, in his final, handwritten note, Richard expressed his fervent wish that Emily finds the happiness this house could not give her as a child. An explosive silence hung in the air. Victoria's lips tightened, her painted fingernails digging crescent moons into the antique armrest. Chloe's face drained of all color, then blossomed with a flush of hot anger and disbelief. Victoria's response was immediate and venomous. This is absurd, she snapped, voice trembling with forced restraint. Richard would never have shut out his own wife. I want to see the signature. This can't be real. There must be a mistake. Mr. Sanders, prepared for the pushback, calmly produced the signed and notarized documents. Everything is in order, Mrs. Carter. These are your husband's explicit wishes. Chloe stood up so quickly, the chair screeched against the hardwood. What about us? He promised me the vacation house, the cars. How could he do this to his own family? Her voice cracked, not with grief, but with outrage and entitlement. Victoria glared at Emily, as though she had orchestrated it all. Emily stared at her hands, heart thunderously loud in her ears, unable to process the reality. Suddenly, she was heiress to everything that had once isolated her. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like being thrust into a spotlight she'd spent her life avoiding. The days that followed were a whirlwind of backlash. Victoria wasted no time. Within hours, she began calling lawyers, floating rumors throughout the neighborhood that Emily had manipulated her dying father, that she'd used her fragile innocence as a weapon. Chloe flooded social media with cryptic posts, painting herself as the wronged victim, stirring sympathy while slyly rallying support for a legal challenge. It wasn't only within the Carter household that the repercussions were felt. Former friends and acquaintances, smelling scandal, began to surface with thinly veiled questions. Whisper campaigns gained steam. How had Emily snatched the inheritance? Was Victoria truly heartbroken? Or had she been blindsided by things beyond her control? The Carter name, once synonymous with discretion and dignity, was on every tongue in their affluent suburb, often for all the wrong reasons. At home, the war of cold shoulders and sharper words escalated. Victoria and Chloe's presence became a performance of spite and wounded pride, slamming doors and staging arguments just loud enough for Emily to hear. Staff, fearing retribution from either side, kept their heads down and their opinions closer. The old gardener, who'd once given Emily solace, now avoided her gaze. Even the family dog, picked up and coddled by Chloe, seemed caught in the shifting tides. Emily was forced to reckon with a new, daunting reality. Power she had never asked for. In a house so divided, it felt almost haunted. She read and reread her father's last note late at night, searching for direction. Its words were raw and intimate, unguarded in a way he had never been to her face. Emily, remember that true strength is kindness wielded wisely. This home needs healing more than victory. But the world outside and within was not so easily soothed. Victoria, refusing to accept defeat, began consulting with every attorney who would take her calls, threatening lawsuits and leveraging connections. She planted stories with local reporters, anonymous accusations that Emily was unstable, ungrateful, even vindictive. Emily found herself on the receiving end of suspicious glances at the grocery store and shunned during the local church service. For all her newfound wealth and power, Emily longed for simple peace. The luxury that had always felt suffocating now became an armor and a burden. She moved through her days, hyper-aware that every choice would be scrutinized, dissected, reported back to Victoria's hungry circle. Still, beneath her uncertainty, something new began to flicker, a quiet resolve. Where once she had tiptoed through the Carter estate, avoiding every confrontation, Emily now stood straighter.
You can do this.
Each time Victoria spat venom, each time Chloe lashed out in public, Emily reminded herself of her father's wish, not for bitter victory, but for meaningful change. She started reaching out to staff privately, assuring them of their jobs and thanking them for their patience. She had the locks changed on the mansion's private offices and asked Mr. Sanders not to respond to threats from Victoria's camp until she was ready.
Why am I different?
The fateful will had upended every expectation, exposing ugly truths and shifting the foundation of Emily's world. Yet, as storm clouds gathered, Emily found unexpected strength in the cracks, an invitation to choose her own legacy, to decide whether the Carter mansion would remain a prison or become, at last, a place of hope. Rock bottom, Emily's life had become a twisted fishbowl, every movement magnified, every word analyzed under an unforgiving spotlight. In the aftermath of the dramatic will reading, the Carter mansion seemed saturated with tension and suspicion. The grand old house was no longer merely cold, it was hostile, each corner echoing with whispered accusations and the unspoken resentment of its inhabitants. Almost overnight, Emily became the center of a storm she never asked for. Rumors, some wild, others surgically crafted, rippled through the town and across social media, each one more damaging than the last. Local tabloids started featuring lurid headlines: heiress or heartbreaker, the mystery of Emily Carter, and stepmother betrayed. Insiders spill mansion secrets, photos of Emily crossing the front drive, visiting her late father's grave, even staring blankly from second-story windows, were snapped by camera phones or lurking reporters stationed in parked cars outside the property's wrought iron gate. It wasn't just the press. People Emily once considered acquaintances or distant friends now treated her with wary curiosity or overt disdain. Some neighbors, who used to greet her with polite smiles and cordial waves, crossed the street to avoid her. At the upscale market, where the family's account went back decades, Emily felt eyes following her, heard bursts of hushed laughter from young cashiers who, until recently, had seemed almost friendly. Worse, those who had once shared even the vaguest kindness: household staff, tutors, the gardener who protected her secret nook among the roses, now avoided her gaze, fearing the wrath of Victoria or the fallout from taking sides. Emily saw the fear in their tremulous good mornings, felt the chill in their careful indifference. Some vanished overnight, resignations, abrupt firings, or perhaps calculated desertions
So, how was your
to
English
align
class?
themselves
I thought the
with
discussion on
Victoria's
literary theory was a bit
rumored new
abstract,
power
didn't you?
base
Yes, a
in
little.
town.
I
Inside
am
the
more than
mansion,
just a ghost of
the
who I
air
once
was
was.
thick with power
I am
plays.
strong, capable,
Victoria's
and ready for
unnaturally loud
anything.
phone calls became a soundtrack of legal threats, whispered consultations, and well-timed sobs for sympathetic ears. Chloe's anger
So, let's start with
was
chapter
more
3, shall
youthful
we?
and public.
I'm a
She
bit stuck on the
slammed
last
doors,
section.
sent out passive-aggressive social posts, and held dramatic phone calls in the hallways that always seemed to end with
These
her
findings
wiping away
suggest a
crocodile
paradigm
tears,
shift in our
making
understanding.
sure Emily heard every word. Emily sought shelter in the few spaces Victoria and Chloe seemed to ignore: the unused East Wing, her tiny attic retreat, or, late at night, the cold stone steps behind the kitchen. But not even in these pockets of peace could she escape the weight pressing inward from all sides. She slept
it is.
little, haunted by anxiety, waking from dreams in which every room of the house was filled with people pointing and judging. Sometimes
Let's keep up
she
this great
wandered
work, team.
sleeplessly from one dark window to another, watching the lonely pulse of headlights sweeping past
got
the
this.
driveway, wondering what it would be
You've got
like
this.
simply
Just keep
to
going.
disappear. Her world, already so narrow,
Funny.
seemed to shrink further. Friends from school, once a thin but precious lifeline, dried up overnight. Texts and emails went unanswered. Invitations she'd hesitated to send for fear of rejection now seemed pointless. When she tried reaching out to a college friend, the conversation turned awkward, filled with canned sympathies and an embarrassing undercurrent of curiosity about the inheritance scandal. Even the local church, where she'd sometimes found comfort in the back pew, closed ranks. After Sunday service, women she'd seen every week for years offered only tight, distant smiles as they hurried past. Yet the greatest blow came not from strangers, nor from foes, but from silence, the hollow echo of loss and abandonment. In her heart, Emily mourned not just her father, but also the hope that with his passing, her life might veer toward something gentler. Instead,
Well, you
the
certainly took
walls
your time.
closed further in. If she expected comfort from the members of the household whom Victoria had once abused, a maid who'd been unjustly fired,
We
a
are on track for
groundskeeper
a
laid off
successful
to
restoration
save
project,
on
with all
unnecessary
logistical
expenses,
challenges being
she was
effectively
mistaken. Many wanted nothing to do with the Carter name, no matter which face wore it now. For some, Emily represented the same privilege and, unfortunately, collateral cruelty that they had suffered under Victoria's regime. For others, their injuries went too deep for recognition or forgiveness. In this way, Emily experienced the full sweep of her stepmother's
Weather has been
legacy,
quite relentless
a
lately,
house
has it not?
and reputation so poisoned that even those who should have been her natural allies drifted away. The weeks blurred. Emily met
Thank you,
daily
Lily.
with
Your
estate
work on the
lawyers,
town hall has been
forced by
truly
necessity to
We are
learn the
all so
language
grateful for your
of
dedication and
trusts,
skill.
taxes, and asset management. She dutifully signed forms, read letters of condolence, and fielded thinly disguised requests for clarification from relatives she barely remembered, knowing all the while that every action was being judged. She was accused of collusion, manipulation, ungratefulness, and, by the lowest of the tabloid rags, even emotional blackmail against her own dying
That isn't
father.
allowed, Dad.
Victoria and
It's a
Chloe
conflict of
took their
interest.
campaign
understand.
public. Victoria dressed in deep mourning, eyes red from either tears or clever makeup tricks, and appeared at local charity events, giving pitiful speeches about betrayal and
We are
loss.
united by
Chloe
a
staged
common
a tearful
goal,
video for her
a
social feed,
shared vision for
garnering
our future.
sympathy and hundreds of comments
We
from
must
peers.
restore the old
In every family
standards.
photograph, Victoria cropped Emily out before sharing. In every story, Emily was cast as the villain. The lowest moment came late one night when Emily overheard Chloe laughing in the hallway. "She's never going to survive this,"
Hi, Lily.
Chloe sneered to her mother. "People see right through her little act. Daddy's ghost can't protect her now." The words stung more than Emily wanted to admit. Alone in her childhood room, she wept for the girl she had been and for the woman she'd have to become. One who no longer waited for approval or warmth, but who would simply endure, ice settling around her heart for protection. Still, underneath this avalanche of pain, something fragile persisted. Emily's solitude sharpened her perception, allowing her, finally, to see the broad outlines of her own life story, not as written by Victoria or the gossips of suburban America, but by her own stubborn will. She kept her dignity in public, refused to retaliate with the same venom, kept her voice measured even when surrounded by vipers. There was, slowly, the dawning of something new. Not hope, not yet, but the knowledge that she had survived,
pretend anymore.
that she was still standing, that the Carter mansion held, within its walls, the possibility for something more than survival, a reclamation of meaning, a new answer to all that had come before. For now, though, all she could do was breathe, take one step forward, and remind herself, when you hit rock bottom,
That I failed
the
you.
only way left is up. Awakening and choice. The Carter mansion, once a silent fortress of pain,
I just
had
don't
become a
need your
crucible
approval
for Emily.
anymore.
Every loss, betrayal, and public humiliation had honed her spirit, stripping away illusions she'd long clung to. Yet, as the weeks of isolation and scrutiny wore on, something began to shift inside her. A subtle, insistent stirring that refused to let her surrender. It was not hope, not exactly, but a growing determination to choose her path, no matter how burdened it was by other people's expectations and grievances. For days, Emily wandered the house with restless purpose. Sunbeams bounced across the parquet floors, illuminating corners where dust gathered on portraits and polished banisters. She paused often, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of history pressing down. If her father's final letter had haunted her before, now it became a fragile guidepost. This home needs healing more than victory. She repeated the sentiment to herself, testing its meaning against the bitterness in her own heart. At first, she wanted vengeance. In the depths of her loneliness, memories returned of Victoria's icy dismissals, Chloe's cruel laughter, and the staff's fearful avoidance. Emily indulged, briefly, in imagined scenarios where she evicted her stepmother and stepsister at dawn, locking the mansion doors against them forever. She pictured scalding rebukes and public reckonings, reparations for all she had suffered, played out in front of the same neighbors who had once whispered about her family's misfortunes. But Emily soon recognized that revenge, no matter how justified on the surface, offered only ash. Her father's legacy and her own battered conscience demanded a different answer. During a sleepless night spent in the attic, the place she'd once decorated with drawings and childish hopes, Emily confronted her pain directly. She wrote a furious letter addressed to the universe, spilling every wound and grudge onto the page. Then, carefully, she burned it in a tin tray, watching the paper curl and blacken, feeling the knots in her chest loosen just a fraction. That ritual was her turning point. In the morning, eyes red, but mind clearer, Emily began the work of reclaiming her life. not through grand gestures, but with small, deliberate acts of defiance against bitterness. Instead of focusing on those who had harmed her, she resolved to look outward, to the people overlooked, the wounds ignored, the possibilities for good that existed even in so toxic a place. She started with the household staff, those who remained moved with caution, wary of the shifting alliances in the house. Emily sought them out gently and privately, meeting in the kitchen in the quiet hours after dawn. She listened, truly listened, to their stories. The young maid who feared reprisal for a single forgotten task. The gardener who had been forced to uproot rose bushes, planted in memory of a beloved parent, just to appease one of Chloe's tantrums. To each, Emily offered reassurance. Their jobs were safe, and, more importantly, their dignity mattered. Where possible, she reinstated long-standing employees Victoria had dismissed for trivial reasons, apologizing for her years of passive silence. Word spread quietly through the mansion. Trust, slow to return, began with tentative smiles and grateful nods. Emily knew she was far from erasing old wrongs, but the work itself, the act of taking responsibility, restored a sense of self-worth that had been long denied her. Her next step was more difficult and more public. Remembering friends her family had harmed or ostracized, she penned letters and made calls, offering apologies, explanations, and sometimes invitations to reconnect. Some responses were chilly or suspicious. Others came with anger or the awkwardness of wounds too deep to heal quickly. But gradually, Emily discovered allies among people who, like her, had learned to endure and adapt. With their encouragement, she began to participate, tentatively, in community life, volunteering at a local shelter, donating books to the school library, attending neighborhood meetings, not as a Carter, but as Emily. These gestures did not escape Victoria's notice. Her stepmother, growing more desperate and isolated, tried to paint Emily's kindness as manipulation. Chloe, deprived of her former power, oscillated between sullen avoidance and peevish complaints. The old battle lines, however, failed to hold. As the mansion's atmosphere softened, laughing voices trickling back into rooms left silent for too long, Victoria and Chloe's grip on the household began to slip. But kindness did not negate complexity. In the privacy of her bedroom, Emily still struggled with anger. She spent long hours wrestling with legal documents and fielding veiled threats from Victoria's lawyers, who sought loopholes and technicalities to undermine the will. Each new accusation made her flinch. Each ugly rumor tested her resolve. Time and again, Emily recommitted to her choice, not to lash out, not to become cruel simply because cruelty had shaped her past. She also pursued justice, not revenge. Quietly, with help from her father's trusted attorney, she compiled evidence of Victoria's misdeeds, embezzlement from the household budget, forged expenses, manipulation of staff, and even attempts to bribe city officials on zoning issues. Emily presented this information to the authorities only after all other avenues of reconciliation had failed. She insisted on fair process and refused to gloat when, inevitably, the case went to court. There were moments of heartbreak. Some workers and townsfolk, shaped by years of gossip, chose to keep their distance. Chloe's friends refused overtures of peace and sometimes mocked Emily's efforts online. Yet, seeds planted in humility and self-restraint took root. A few former staff members returned, expressing cautious hope for a better future. A neighbor who had once ignored Emily at church stopped her in the street to offer thanks for a charitable project she initiated. Perhaps most meaningful of all, the mansion itself seemed to breathe easier. Windows were thrown open to sunlight and summer breezes. The kitchen, once a war zone of silent, nervous efficiency, buzzed with laughter and shared stories as meals became communal again, rather than lonely rituals
I was
under
just trying to
Victoria's
help.
glare. Emily encouraged celebrations, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, long denied or soured by the old regime. Each
This is all
event
our
was
fault.
small, imperfect, but genuine.
Good luck.
Through it all, Emily realized that true peace came not from the absence of pain, but from meeting it head on and choosing differently. She had no power to change the past, nor to force others to embrace her,
Isn't it?
but she could refuse to perpetuate a cycle of harm. In doing so, she found, day by day, a new sense of power, one rooted in compassion and the kind of quiet, persistent bravery that had once seemed impossible. By autumn's end,
I'm sorry.
the Carter mansion was transformed
I should have
in
been
ways
kinder
both
to you.
subtle and profound. Emily could walk the halls without flinching, host former adversaries with sincerity, and, most importantly, look into the mirror without shame. She stood at a crossroads, knowing more battles lay ahead. But now she walked forward, not as a victim or a reluctant heiress, but as a woman defined by her choices, awake, resolute, and ready for whatever the future would hold. The fall of Victoria
I am
rumors
truly
had
sorry.
always swirled around the Carter mansion, but as winter crept
Forgive
over
me.
the estate, they thickened and gained sharper teeth. The tension that once simmered beneath polite surfaces now burst open in fractures, impossible to hide. Victoria,
I am not
once
sure
the
what you
flawless architect of the Carter image, the gracious hostess, the social queen, found her world crumbling, not only from within, but also from all directions, outside her carefully maintained walls. It began with a few whispered stories. Disquieted staff spoke of missing payments, of bonuses promised but never delivered. Vendors complained, quietly at first, about invoices submitted for supplies that never arrived, signed by Victoria herself. A friend of Emily's, working part-time at the local newspaper, overheard a heated phone call at a cafe. A supplier demanding answers from someone who, despite outward calm, was clearly frantic. Victoria's grip on the Carter fortune was slipping, and there was no elegant way to disguise the growing cracks. Emily was different now, both privately and publicly. Where she had once shrunk from confrontation, now she moved with quiet resolve, encouraged by the trust she'd rebuilt with the staff. And armed with the knowledge left by her father, she decided it was time to confront not just Victoria's cruelty, but her corruption. Working closely with Mr. Sanders, the family lawyer who had long watched, wary and wise, Emily methodically gathered evidence. Late at night, she pored over bank statements Victoria had once tried to keep hidden, cross-referencing household expenses against Victoria's lavish shopping sprees. She compared payroll records and meticulously interviewed former staff members, some of whom were relieved to finally be able to voice their grievances. Each new detail Emily learned was another nail in the coffin of Victoria's reign. She discovered forged invoices, double billing, even attempts to siphon funds from Carter Holdings to shell accounts in Victoria's maiden name. Emily's anger burned, but she kept it hidden, channeling her energy into diligence rather than drama. As Emily compiled this mountain of evidence, she also found strength in her new allies. The staff, now loyal to her, risked their jobs to hand her files and recount stories of intimidation. Former friends, once wary, now offered support. Emily also noticed a shift in the community. Rumors about her began to change as word spread that the Carter heiress was trying to make things right, and that Victoria, and by extension Chloe, were not as innocent as they pretended to be. It wasn't long before Victoria noticed the change. Doors slammed harder. Her voice, always icy, now had an edge of desperation. She tried to tighten her grip on anyone who might still defend her. The caterer, who had planned the infamous Carter parties, the young lawyer she thought she could manipulate, even Chloe, whose loyalty was wavering under the weight of her mother's fear. But Victoria could sense the walls closing in. She responded like a wounded animal, doubling down on manipulation and public displays of injury. At local charity events, she wore black, spoke dramatically of betrayal, and dropped hints about Emily being unwell. Chloe, meanwhile, was adrift, her mother's world falling apart, her former privileges stripped, her friends quietly distancing themselves from the growing scandal. Unable to cope, she lashed out in petty ways, vandalizing Emily's childhood drawings, spreading false rumors online, and making late-night phone calls to family members across the state in a futile attempt to garner sympathy. Emily, torn between anger and a faint trace of pity, pressed forward. She did not seek outright revenge. She wanted justice. But more so, she wanted an end to the culture of fear and greed. With Mr. Sanders' help, Emily approached both the authorities and the board of Carter Holdings. A formal report was filed. Financial fraud, embezzlement of company funds, tax evasion, and evidence of attempts to bribe city officials. The legal wheels, slow but inexorable, began to turn. Word spread fast. The headlines that once skewered Emily now featured Victoria's name alongside words like investigation and fraud. Anonymous insiders leaked details to the press, lavish accounts in offshore banks, hush money to former employees, forged signatures on contracts. Victoria tried to make herself small, avoiding the outside world during the investigation, drawing the curtains, and only appearing at public events when necessary. Her phone, once a tool for orchestrating power, became a hotline of panic. Lawyers, consultants, distant relatives calling either to offer help or, more often, to distance themselves. In public, Victoria's composure remained brittle. She would arrive at the country club, head held high, only to find conversations drying up at her approach. Friends who used to defer to her now offered cold smiles, or none at all. The charity boards she sat on quietly let her go, citing unforeseen circumstances. The legal process gathered momentum. Investigators conducted interviews and seized records. Reporters camped outside the Carter gates, snapping photos and thrusting microphones through the bars at anyone who entered or left. Chloe's efforts to rally support for her mother failed. Her own social media posts became a magnet for cruel comments, many urging her to face reality or learn from her mother's mistakes. Even among her own peers, Chloe found herself increasingly alone, her name now synonymous with scandal. Inside the mansion, the dynamic shifted daily. Victoria raged at first, accusing Emily of betrayal, vowing that she would overturn the will, warning her that no judge or jury would believe a weak little girl's sob story. But Emily refused to respond with rage. She kept her communication calm, documenting every threat, every underhanded move, and sharing them only with the legal team. As the case
See
built
here,
publicly,
this data point is
the
crucial.
staff, long afraid of Victoria, now ignored her orders entirely, taking their direction
While I
from
appreciate
Emily
the
instead.
enthusiasm, the idea
The
might need a bit
household,
more refinement
for the
to be
first time
presented.
in years, began to feel
The
less
data
like a
clearly
kingdom
indicates a
and more like a
significant
home.
upward trend,
The community's
exceeding our
verdict
initial
became clear
projections.
long before the judges. At the market,
Emily,
at
your
school,
thoroughness on this
even at the
case has been
church
truly
Victoria had
exceptional.
once used for social leverage. People murmured about karma, about the dark truth finally catching up with the Carter matriarch. Emily,
And that's when I
while still
realized
treated with some
we weren't
caution,
just looking for
was no
adventure,
longer the target
we were
of open
creating
hostility.
memories.
Slowly, a few townspeople offered support, sometimes in words, more often in small acts of inclusion, like invitations to community events or friendly nods as she passed. It ended with less drama than Victoria would have wanted it. Authorities formally charged her with financial crimes. Her assets were frozen, her social standing decimated. Chloe, technically an adult, was removed from all trust funds pending investigation. There was no grand apology, no acknowledgement of guilt, just the image of Victoria being escorted out of the estate, dignity in shreds, blaming everyone but herself. Chloe followed silently, suitcase in hand,
Present.
her anger burned out, her future uncertain. Emily stood at a window, watching their departure. There was no triumph in her heart, only relief and the faint hope that, in clearing the rot, something
assure you, what
alive and
happened was a
authentic
complete
could begin to grow in its place. She told herself
Just
she
go.
would not become hardened by the ordeal. She would, instead, use her father's legacy and even the debris of Victoria's ruin to shape a life and a home defined not by fear, but by compassion and integrity. As the winter sun rose over the Carter estate, Emily breathed in the promise of change. A promise she was, finally, free to claim for herself. Justice revealed.
Lily, your
News
recent
of
actions have raised
Victoria's
serious
arrest
concerns among the
rippled
board
across the
members. I
town
assure you, my
like a
intentions were
thunderclap.
always in the best
For
interest of the
years,
organization.
the Carter name
so
had
funny.
dominated local headlines for charity
Should've seen your
galas,
face.
business deals,
Oh
and
my
social
goodness.
functions. Now, it was splashed on front pages and whispered among neighbors for entirely different reasons. Fraud,
Accountability is about owning our
embezzlement,
choices,
and
our
betrayal
actions, and their
at the
impact,
highest
both
echelons
individually
of
and as a
privilege.
team.
Emily could
We are
hardly leave the
truly honored to
mansion
present a solution
without
that not
encountering
only addresses our
reporters,
immediate challenges,
their
but
questions
also paves the way for
sharp-edged
a
and
more sustainable
relentless,
future.
as Victoria's dark dealings became the town's chief obsession. In the days after Victoria's resignation from all charity boards and the public freezing of her assets, the courtroom became a stage. Journalists vied for
My
spots
company has a
on
unique
rain-slicked
opportunity for
courthouse steps.
collaboration, leveraging our
Photographers
extensive network.
craned for the perfect shot, and satellite trucks lined Main Street. Each morning, headlines trumpeted new revelations: the shell companies, the bribes, the intimidation
Are you
tactics
falling behind?
that had kept staff and
Are you falling
rivals
behind?
silent for years. The Carter estate's gates, once symbols of exclusivity, now seemed a fortress, hiding not
We
wealth,
expect this
but
innovative
shame.
approach to yield
Emily attended the
substantial
hearings,
returns,
accompanied by
truly a
Mr.
testament to our
Sanders
team's collaborative
and a few
spirit.
loyal staff
We
members.
have a tight deadline on
She
this
did not
project.
crave the spectacle,
So we need to ensure
but
all
she
our
recognized
resources
her
are optimized.
responsibility
I suggest
to
we
witness
reallocate
the
some of the
outcome.
team.
Each day
That's
she
a
sat
brave
quietly
choice of
near the
outfit for
back,
the meeting.
her presence a silent statement that the future of her family's legacy would not
So
be
glad you could
rooted
make
in
it.
deception or fear. The prosecution presented damning
for having me.
evidence. Accountants laid out ledgers documenting the siphoning of funds from Carter Holdings. Contractors testified about falsified invoices and unpaid bills. Several long-serving
There is no
employees
reason to be sad.
fought
We love
nerves
you.
to recount incidents of threats, unpaid overtime, and hush money, offered to keep workplace abuses secret. More than once, Emily saw tears shimmer in their eyes, not just from fear or humiliation, but from relief that the truth was finally being spoken aloud. Victoria's legal defense was formidable, but no amount of well-practiced indignation
Emily,
could hide the
I must
facts.
admit,
On the
your
witness
recent
stand,
performance has
Victoria
given me
alternated
significant cause for
between
concern.
tearful denial and cold calculation. At times, she attempted to portray herself as the victim of a vindictive stepdaughter, of a misunderstanding, of a world eager to pen her downfall. Chloe, summoned as a witness, was pale and subdued, her testimony faltering and contradictory, as she tried to reconstruct a narrative that would spare her mother and herself. But facts were facts. When questioned about forged documents, Chloe could do little but lower her head and mutter, "I don't know." While outside the courthouse, the public divided itself into camps, some
Hi,
expressing
is this spot
sympathy
taken?
for Victoria,
No.
others
Please join
jeering
us.
at her downfall. Inside, the process
Whistleblowers face
remained
significant
methodical
personal risk
and relentless.
sacrifice, but
The
their
judge's
actions often
patience
lead to
wore
vital
thin
societal
at Victoria's
changes.
evasions and her lawyer's objections. But ultimately, the verdict was not in doubt. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. The air inside seemed charged, as though the entire town had come to a halt,
Embrace the journey,
waiting for
for
justice
every
to finally be
challenge
rendered.
overcome builds the
Victoria
foundation of
sat
your future
stone-faced,
success.
her former
do we do
poise
now?
shattered. The judge spoke firmly,
We need to be
laying
careful.
out the
Yes,
scope of her
very
crimes, the years of deception, the injuries to both the Carter business and the household staff. Victoria was sentenced not just to prison time, but to restitution. Her remaining assets seized to repay her victims and replenish the charitable foundations she had siphoned from. Chloe, while not criminally charged, found herself barred from all Carter funds. She was left to carve a new life, stripped of privilege and protection. For the first time, the community saw her not as an extension of her mother, but as a young woman standing on uncertain ground.
It's a lovely
For
day,
Emily,
isn't it?
the end of the trial brought no sense of victory. She left the courthouse not to cheers, but under a gray sky threatening rain. Reporters called her name, hoping for a quote, but she kept her head down and her answers brief. She had never wanted vengeance. The public humiliation visited on her family was neither catharsis nor triumph. Instead, she felt the weight of loss, of her father, of a childhood poisoned by neglect, of a family name stained by scandal. Yet, beneath that sorrow, Emily sensed a clearing. The Carter mansion, stripped of Victoria's shadow, felt different now. The air, once heavy with secrets and suspicion, seemed lighter. Staff walked the halls with ease. Their laughter no longer stifled the moment footsteps echoed on marble. Emily, after so long on the margins of her own home, started meeting with each employee individually, listening to their ideas for improving work life, honoring their years of dedication, and welcoming back those who wished to return. Justice also arrived in more subtle ways. Public sentiment, sharp and unforgiving at first, gradually softened. Neighbors whose comments had once skewered Emily now greeted her with cautious warmth. At Sunday service, the pastor's sermon quietly acknowledged the power of truth and forgiveness. Where the Carters had once sponsored events for prestige, Emily volunteered quietly, serving food at the shelter, cleaning up town parks, advocating for staff rights at the local council. Some gestures were met with skepticism, but most with gratitude. Over time, Emily's actions spoke more loudly than any headlines. She became less a figure of scandal and more one of quiet integrity. The aftermath of the trial forced Chloe into difficult choices. With no fortune to fall back on, she moved into a small apartment on the far side of town and found work at a boutique. There, She was anonymous,
You won't believe
no
what I
longer
just heard about the new
recognizable
project.
as
Oh, do
Victoria's
tell.
daughter. Just Chloe, a young woman learning humility and accountability. Though she rarely spoke with
Betrayal
Emily,
is an
a
essential
simple
rite of
note
passage.
arrived one spring afternoon. It read,
So the next
"I'm
steps are
sorry.
clear, and
Maybe
I'm
one day
confident
we
we'll
can start
achieve our
over."
goals.
For Emily, it was a small but profound sign that cycles of pain could be broken. The greatest transformation, however, occurred within Emily herself. She understood now that justice, while necessary, was not an endpoint. It did not erase trauma or undo years of emotional harm. True restoration, she realized, was ongoing, a daily commitment to act differently, to lead with empathy, to let the wounds air and heal. The Carter estate, once a palace of secrecy and isolation, slowly became a home. Emily opened its doors, not for opulent
I
parties,
can always rely
but
on
for
Emily's
community
thoroughness.
gatherings, for
good to
staff
hear.
appreciation dinners, for quiet evenings with friends who had weathered the storm
How
by
have
her
things been going
side.
for you,
She
Jessica?
established a fund in her father's name
busy
to
as
support
always.
household employees and vulnerable women in the region, seeking to ensure that no one else would endure
Would you want to
what
do
she
lunch today?
had in silence.
Unfortunately,
With
I am
Victoria
all booked up.
sentenced and Chloe forging her own path, Emily stood alone, but not lonely. In the
Understanding your
stillness,
opponent's
after the
motivations
storm,
is crucial for
she felt at
successful
peace for the
negotiation.
first time. The path ahead would not be simple. There would be more gossip, more doubts, more choices that risked her
You're a
newfound
little too confident
tranquility.
for your own good.
But Emily had discovered, in the crucible of her suffering, an inner strength that could neither be bought nor inherited. This, she realized, was the true meaning of justice. Not the
So true.
punishment of those who harmed her, but the reclamation of her own worth and the opportunity to build, at last, a life defined by kindness and courage. A new beginning, the Carter estate, once heavy with secrets and sorrow, began to breathe again. The transformation was neither instant nor dramatic. Rather, it unfolded gradually as Emily embraced her promise to rebuild not just the house, but its spirit, where once long hallways echoed
empty.
with suspicion and the distant rattle of arguments. They now
I'd like to
filled,
thank Kevin
little by
for his
little,
invaluable
with new
contribution to
sounds,
these key findings.
gentle laughter, the measured rhythm of conversation, and the unmistakable notes of hope.
Is it true
The
what they
first
are
step
saying about
was
Emily
the
falling
simplest,
behind?
but for Emily, the most meaningful, reaching out to those her family's legacy had wounded. She began by establishing the Carter Foundation, a modest but heartfelt fund set up to provide opportunities for people who had been burdened by misfortune or unfairness. In her father's name, she invited former staff members and local women who had known hardship to join her in shaping the initiative. For the first time, the Carter fortune was directed toward healing instead of exclusion. It wasn't easy to win back trust. Some of the people she contacted, maids dismissed for trivial errors, gardeners let go in fits of temper, secretaries who had quit rather than face another slight, were wary, unsure if the gesture was genuine. Emily met with them personally, sometimes sitting in humble kitchens over coffee, sometimes walking with them through old gardens heavy with memory. She listened more than she spoke, apologizing without excuses for all that had happened. For some, the wounds were too deep to revisit, but for others, the possibility of reconciliation was enough. Those who chose to return brought not just their expertise, but an outlook shaped by surviving adversity. Slowly, the staff took shape once more. The mansion's atmosphere changed with their presence. Meals reverted from cold, formal affairs to gatherings buzzing with warmth. Newcomers learning favorite family recipes from old staff, Inside jokes retold at the end of busy days. Emily joined in when she could, not as a distant employer, but as a collaborator and, eventually, a friend. The kitchen, once a silent battleground, was now the heart of the home. Outside the estate's gates, whispers about the new Carter house trickled through the suburban streets. At first, the community's pride remained stung by past scandal. But soon, there was curiosity, even guarded optimism. Emily reached out, inviting neighbors to informational sessions on the Carter Foundation's grants and scholarships, encouraging them to nominate families or individuals in need. It was a gesture as much about making amends as about forging new connections. She understood that acceptance couldn't be forced. It had to be built through consistency, listening, and humility. One by one, small acts of kindness rebuilt bridges. Emily visited local small businesses affected by her family's prior indifference, vowing to support them. She attended town hall meetings anonymously, offered resources to the school library, volunteered at the food pantry, and adopted a doors open policy for anyone wishing to speak with her. The Carter estate, once a fortress ringed with suspicion and neglect, reopened as a community resource, a place for neighborhood gatherings, children's art, shows, even workshops teaching household skills and financial literacy, practical forms of empowerment she herself had once lacked. Among those who returned was Mrs. Nguyen, a former housekeeper let go years prior after a single, misunderstood mistake. Hesitant but hopeful, she accepted Emily's invitation. Together with Emily, she created a program within the foundation to train women facing hardship in hospitality and management, offering not just employment, but dignity and personal growth. The program drew participants from across the county, some arriving with little more than hope. Many found in the Carter mansion not just a job, but a sense of belonging, a new family forged in resilience. Inside the mansion, Emily celebrated these small victories, but she remained attentive to shadows. She understood the healing process would take time for everyone, herself included. Emily spent evenings in the attic, her sanctuary since childhood, reflecting on how far she'd come and still had to go. She kept her father's words close. This home needs healing more than victory. In moments of doubt, she reread old letters from past employees or listened to the kitchen's soft hum, reminding herself that change, to endure, must be both honest and persistent. Soon, the holiday season arrived. For the first time in years, the Carter home was alive with the bright, restless energy of festivities. Decorations were chosen as a group, each staff member bringing a piece of their own tradition. Emily wrote invitations for the neighborhood, scribbling personal notes of gratitude and apology. Old rivalries faded beside crackling fireplaces and shared meals. There were awkward moments. Apprehension lingered among those still wary of the Carter name. But laughter eventually loosened the solemnity. On a particularly cold December evening, Emily stood on the manor's steps, watching children build a snowman near the rose garden she had once hidden in. The garden, like the house, was reclaiming its beauty. Neglected soil nurtured back to life, new buds pressing up through the frost. A sense of belonging welled within her. Not entitlement, but genuine membership in something greater than herself. That same winter, Chloe sent a letter, handwritten and unsteady. She was working downtown now, making ends meet, finding her own identity. The note didn't dwell on apologies. It simply thanked Emily for a small gift she had sent Chloe's way through a foundation program. It was enough, Emily replied, offering kindness and the assurance that she, too, was welcome to let go of the bitterness of their old life. They weren't ready to be sisters, but the path to forgiveness was open. By spring, the transformation was unmistakable. The Carter estate held workshops for single mothers, partnered with local shelters to house women rebuilding their lives, and hosted students from underfunded schools for arts festivals and science fairs. Staff meetings closed with potlucks and music. The house that once embodied pride and exclusion now radiated hospitality and learning. In this new chapter, Emily discovered that genuine leadership was not about authority or perfection. It was about accountability for old wrongs, openness to growth, and respect for all who crossed her threshold. She led not from a pedestal, but from within the very community she hoped to uplift, learning from failures as much as from triumphs. Looking back, Emily realized that every hurt and humiliation had taught her how to choose, how to build, how to forgive, how to offer second chances. The Carter name was no longer a burden to be endured, but a promise she chose to renew, one relationship at a time. As sunlight filtered through newly polished windows, Emily answered the door to a group of children coming for the weekly reading circle. In their laughter, she heard the mansion's true legacy, not one of wealth or scandal, but one of rebirth and hope. And so, the Carter estate's new story began, not in headlines or scandal, but in daily acts of courage and kindness. For Emily and all who shared her vision, this was indeed a new beginning. True peace. The winter sun rose quietly over the Carter estate, painting the old mansion in hues of pale gold and delicate blue. Snow lingered on the grounds, softening the sharp edges of statues and hedges, and a gentle hush seemed to rest over the property. Inside, however, the house pulsed with a different energy, one that Emily Carter had never truly felt as a child. It was the presence of peace, a subtle, enduring warmth, not just of comfort, but of acceptance. In the months since the Carter name had shifted from scandal to renewal, Emily had worked tirelessly, not just to mend her home, but to mend herself. Peace, she learned, did not arrive on some pivotal afternoon or after a dramatic epiphany. It grew slowly, like light stretching across frosted glass, rarely noticed except in retrospect. Now, as winter began giving way to the soft hints of spring, she finally sensed its arrival. Emily's days settled into a deliberate, nourishing rhythm. In the mornings, she walked the old estate paths, boots crunching in the melting snow, breathing in the sharp, clean air. Birds had returned earlier than expected, a sign, she felt, of nature's willingness to forgive. Sometimes a staff member would join her, sharing quiet reflection or gentle laughter. The conversations were never forced. They flowed with an ease unfamiliar in the mansion's oppressive past. Daily rituals became her guideposts. Every afternoon, Emily met with staff not as the mistress of the house, but as a member of their chosen family. Together, they brainstormed new outreach projects for the foundation, shared stories over hot tea, and learned new skills from one another. Ella, the gardener, taught Emily how to prune roses. Young Thomas, the cook's apprentice, introduced her to the comfort of homemade bread. She found healing not in grand gestures, but in simple, shared moments. On Sundays, Emily attended church, not out of obligation, but because she found solace in community. People greeted her with honest eyes, There was no trace of suspicion or gossip. She volunteered quietly,
at work?
helping with reading circles for children or organizing food drives. The work was not about redemption, but about presence, of giving, receiving, and being seen as simply Emily,
Hi, is everything okay?
not as a Carter or an heiress. Upstairs, in the little attic, brightened by new paint and sunlight, Emily set aside time for reflection. She could still remember her childhood self, curled up among forgotten trunks, sketching dreams on faded paper. Now, she journaled about gratitude, acknowledging the scars that shaped her, but did not define her. Sometimes, she wrote letters of thanks. Some delivered, others sealed away as reminders of how far she had journeyed. One snowy evening, as gentle music drifted from the parlor and candles flickered along windowsills, Emily gathered everyone, staff,
Last night was incredible.
new friends,
I can't
a
stop
handful
thinking
of
about you.
neighbors, around the dining table. It was neither a holiday nor an anniversary, but simply a dinner to celebrate having made it through a long winter together. Laughter came easily, and stories emerged of setbacks, turned into triumphs. The housekeeper's daughter, now enrolled in college, with help from the Carter Foundation, two former rivals, now friends, building a garden for those seeking shelter. Emily offered a toast. For the first time, her voice was steady and sure. To old wounds that heal, to kindness that takes root, and to the peace we create every day, together. Afterward, as the house settled into quiet, Emily retreated to the library with tea. She thought of Victoria and Chloe, not with anger, but with a searching kind of compassion. She didn't wonder if they experienced peace in their lives now. True forgiveness, she realized, meant neither forgetfulness nor reconciliation at any cost. It meant a gentle release of bitterness, a hope that even those who'd caused harm might find a gentler path forward. Chloe, every so often, sent a letter, sometimes a small update, sometimes simply a sketch from her new sketchbook. They shared what they could, through words and silences, each committed to their own kind of healing. Victoria's name came up less and less, her shadow receding from the corners of Emily's heart. The mansion,
Focus.
once haunted by rivalry
Next task.
and suspicion, now hummed with the gentle chaos of family and progress. Emily's legacy grew not by chance, but by unhurried intention. The Carter estate, now a sanctuary and community resource, expanded its outreach little by little. A scholarship for young artists, hot meals for those in need, a book club for women who had never found their place in the old world of privilege. Emily made sure every initiative honored both struggle and resilience, reminding herself and others that peace meant more than comfort. It meant belonging, dignity, and knowing one's own worth beyond circumstances. Sometimes, she felt a pang of loneliness, a reminder that healing was rarely complete, but she had learned to sit with it, breathing through the ache rather than fleeing it. On those days, she took solace in the greenhouse, tending rows of herbs and flowers planted by many hands. Growth, she had discovered, was not always visible. Sometimes it happened just below the surface, waiting for sun and rain in the quiet passage of seasons. Where headlines once defined her life, now Emily found meaning in smaller, quieter moments. The grin of a shy child during story time in the mansion's parlor, the grateful handshake from a neighbor whose small business had survived, the cards of thanks left on her door after a storm. These were reminders that even after years of pain and upheaval, the heart could relearn joy. One breezy afternoon, As she stood at the threshold of the
Yes.
Carter estate, Emily realized she no longer feared the future. She was not waiting for happiness to arrive or for wounds to vanish. Instead, she was awake to the beauty and messiness of each moment. She belonged
been under
not
so
to a
much work
legacy of
stress.
reputation or riches, but to a tradition of kindness and quiet strength.
it.
In the end, true peace was not a destination, but a practice, a daily decision to forgive, to gather, to begin again. Emily smiled softly at the thought. She had come home, at last, within herself, and for the first time, the Carter mansion, and those who called it home, truly knew what it was to be at peace.